Hi, this is Andrew Connell with Critical Path Training, and I want to take a minute here to talk about how code executes inside the sandbox in the Sandbox Solution module. So let's first talk about what the process looks like for when I go through and have a web part inside the sandbox and where this stuff is going to go. So what you're going to see here is I'm first going to go through and create a new solution here called the Web Parts of the WSP solution. I'm going to do that inside Visual Studio, and then I'm going to either give that to my my site collection owner, my site collection administrator, or I'm going to deploy them myself straight from Visual Studio if I have permissions to do that. The solution is then going to go into the solution gallery and also be shown in the web part gallery. Once I go through and put them in there and activate them, that's when it's going to be available to everybody. Once that's done, I'm then going to go in and my site or my users are going to then be able, down at the bottom corner here, my users are then going to see that I have access to a web part to add to the page. So I'm then going to go in and add the web part to the page. Now what's going to happen here is in step 4, SharePoint's going to look and say, hey, has this web part already been, has this solution already been pulled out, and do I already have the stuff I need running on the current web front end? And if that answer is no, then what he'll end up doing is he's then going to go to the solution gallery and pull the solution out of the solution gallery, which lives in the content database, extract them out and pull all the pieces out that he needs to run him on the server. He's then going to go through in the sandbox code service is then going to go run that sandbox solution and then hand the results back to the web front end for rendering. So that's how the whole process is going to work here. Now we can look at a little more of the details here of how this stuff is going to happen, where we can see the request coming into the web front end, and then it's going to be working with the user code service over here to make sure that everything is available to us. If it's not there, then you see that it's going to come back over to the user code service, pull the stuff back out, run all the code, and then hand everything back in, run all the code that it needs to run, either on the web front end or on a back end server. We'll talk about the local and remote stuff in a little bit, and how you can configure that, and where these things are going to run and everything. But this is just a little bit more detail on where stuff runs, what host process it's running in, and all that kind of stuff. Now, in another session we talked about you have a subset of the object model that's available to us. And this is just talking about some of that here, where I have access to basically everything inside of the SP site object and then everything below him. But I can't do things like have access to SP security. I can't have access to things like creating site collections. I can't do either one of those things here. So now let's talk a little bit about how our code's going to run with respect to CAS, to code access security, for our sandbox solutions, for solutions that are in the sandbox. So what you see here is that I have my DLL over here where it's going to contain my web part and then any other assemblies that I've added to my sandbox solution that I need to run, like maybe third-party UI components and stuff. And then I'm also going to have, I'm also going to need to reference the SharePoint assembly as well, which is also going to kind of run inside the sandbox here. Now, what's going to happen is that when my code is running, he's not going to be running against the full SharePoint assembly. He's going to be going against a little subset object that's going to have only certain things that are available to me, and then the SharePoint object model is going to run inside of full trust. My code itself is not going to run inside, is not going to run with full trust. He's going to run inside of a special CAS policy that's been set up inside the by Microsoft for the user code service, and that's going to be defined inside the WSS user code.config to define the CAS policy. That's going to say what my stuff can and can't do. So that's what's going to block certain calls and things like that. It's also going to be a way for me to define any kind of web services that I'm allowed to go through and call out, or where those web services are. So that's just a little bit how things are going to run within the sandbox. Now let's talk about something about when I'm going through and creating these things, what the difference is between what things I'm going to be running, between the full trust and the subset object model, and then how these things are going to work. And then there's a little bit of a trick that may kind of trip people up when you're creating custom ones. In Visual Studio 2010, what I showed in another session was that when you say you're going to create a sandbox solution, what that's going to do here is it's going to go through and it's going to set up IntelliSense so that it's going to hide anything that I'm not allowed to do inside the sandbox. But the trick is that's not a compilation check. That's just a little coding helper check, right? So that I could still go through and I could still type in spsecurity.run with elevated privileges. And while spsecurity won't show up initially, it will go through and still show me, it will go through and compile just fine, even though it's not going to run in the sandbox. So that can kind of trip people up. The reason why it's doing this is that when I compile my project in Visual Studio, it's not compiling against a special Microsoft.SharePoint.dll. It's compiling against the full object model DLL that I'm used to going through and compiling against. But the trick is that at runtime, I'm not going to be executing against this fully trusted, or this full API here. I'm going to be running against the subset of the object model, a totally different assembly that's then going to have a proxy into the full SharePoint object model. So this subset over here is what's going to block me from doing a call to SP security or run with elevated privileges. This can be kind of tricky because for those of us who maybe get code off of, say, like a Codeplex site or some other sample or from a book, and then we copy it all into our site, or we take an existing solution and we take a look at it and we just flip it over to the sandbox and compile it and must think, oh, it's going to run just fine in the sandbox. That's not true because we're compiling against the full trust here. Now, there's a way that you can kind of get around this, and it's not something you want to keep, but it's a quick little trick that you could get around. What you could do here is that inside of your project, you have a reference to Microsoft.SharePoint.dll. What you could do as a temporary check is instead of having your project reference this full object model, you could tell it, well, let me go through and let me compile against this subset really quick and show me the places where I'm going to have problems. You'll find this subset right here inside what you see on the slide, where it's inside the 14/usercode/assemblies/Microsoft.SharePoint.dll. When you then go through and compile your project, it'll compile against that assembly. So you first remove the original Microsoft.SharePoint reference, and then you're going to go through and change it to use and add the new one to the user code assembly. That's the way you can check. Just make sure you put it back to the full assembly, because you're not supposed to deploy stuff and really not supposed to go through and work with things against the user code or the sandboxed subset API. You should be doing this against the full one. So that's just a quick little test to make sure that when you compile stuff that you'll see when stuff does and does not work. So now let's go through and let's see how we go through and create a sandbox solution with Visual Studio 2010 and look at this IntelliSense stuff, and then I can show you how the different things are going to compile. So in this demo, I want to show you how to go through and create a sandbox solution and web part we're going to put in the sandbox, and then how to deal with how to go through and change it from a sandbox to a farm solution, look at the properties in the project, and then finally also how to try and get around a little bit of help with the compilation issues that you can run into. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project here, and I'm just going to create a standard SharePoint 2010 empty project here. And then inside this guy, we're going to say we're going to use a sandbox solution, and then our site is intranet.contoso.com. I'm then going to come over and say I'm going to add a new item to it, and my new item is going to be a web part. Now, it's a sandbox solution, so I've gone through and and you see that I've worked with this the same way you'd create anything else inside of SharePoint. So I come over here, I'm going to go get rid of everything else that's in here except for the render contents. Oh, sorry, except for create child controls. And what I want to do is I'm just going to go through and say I want to create a new label, and then I'm going to just for kicks, we're going to say SP security. Now, notice I can't do SP. I'm trying to go through and run with elevated privileges. And notice it's not letting me do this because the IntelliSense is hiding it from me. But if I go through and say SP security, if I know what I'm looking for, I can go through and still type it in. So I could say like label.text is equal to date, time, now, .toString. And then this .controls.add the label. Okay? So that's what we're going to end up running. Now, when I go through and remember, my project is set up to be a sandbox solution. So this code will not run in the sandbox. If I right-click and just say, right-click on the project and build them, we'll see that the build will work just fine, because this is compiling against the Microsoft.SharePoint.dll. But I can go through and let's try and trick it out a little bit, where if I go through to Microsoft.SharePoint and remove that reference and then come back in add a reference, and we'll go find the user code version. So I'll go to C, Program Files, Common Files, Microsoft Shared, Web Server Extensions 14. 12 was the old version. We'll come over here to User Code, look at Assemblies, and there's our Microsoft.SharePoint.dll. Add a reference to him. And then if I try to compile this, we'll then see we should get an error here because SP security does not exist inside this context. So that's a quick little way that you can check to see if stuff inside of here is going to run okay. However, I would strongly recommend you go back, remove the reference to the user code one, and then add a reference back to the full one before you deploy this guy. Obviously, you're going to want to clean up the code here and not use SP security. It doesn't do anything special to the runtime. This is just to help you do a little compile check. So there's you don't want to get a false sense of security here and say like, well, if I did it this way, it'll work just fine, but I did it this other way and it didn't work. So we go back over here to SharePoint, add that reference, and now when I compile this guy, you'll see that the compilation will work just fine. Okay, so you want to be careful with that. So that's one way to go through and do a quick little check here to see the IntelliSense switching back and forth from a sandbox solution to a non-sandbox solution or farm solution, how the IntelliSense hides stuff but doesn't do anything about a compile time check, and how you can build your own compile time check.